Hi everyone, I'm Haley Moss and I am the first openly autistic attorney to be practicing law here in Florida. I'm really excited to get to share with you my story and a little bit about me. I'm also the author of 2 books, an autism self-advocate, as well as an artist.
Haley, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Michelle McEwen. I'm the founder and CEO of Digitability, a work-ready training program for people with neurodiverse needs. Haley, you recently wrote a piece for the Huffington Post where you said that today many people are quick to describe you as high-functioning, but that you still face challenges such as social difficulties, sensory overload, and you even describe things like doing your laundry and driving as your personal Mount Everest. Since Digitability is a program designed to prepare people with neurodiverse needs to overcome the barriers that they may face when pursuing their own transition to independence, I would really love to hear from your perspective what your personal barriers were while you were pursuing your independence and what your journey looked like.
With ableism and invisible disability, as we like to say, I think there comes this point where people think you're not disabled enough to get the help that you might need, because especially with autism and women especially, is we have a lot of coping skills and masking, so we can pass as neurotypical, but that also means that we struggle to get the help we need because you don't look autistic, you don't look disabled, as people say, which there's no one look for it, as we know, but people seem to think there is. So you can face the getting denied an accommodation because you don't look it, because you don't have the history, or you don't have something that says I might need this because you didn't need it at a prior point in time.
Yes, we talk a lot about apparent versus non-apparent disabilities. The idea that non-apparent disability is not apparent until it is, right? Until the person with the neurodiverse needs is in a situation where the disability presents a challenge. So identifying as somebody with a non-apparent disability, you might be familiar with the phrase that disability is the silent D in diversity and inclusion, and that when workplaces think about diversity and inclusion, they tend to think about race, sexuality, gender, and not necessarily disability, which plays into ableism. What was your experience with disclosure around seeking and obtaining employment and becoming a lawyer?
When I was interviewing, I actually wasn't planning on doing the traditional interview thing because of how things happened. I actually met a former lawyer at my law firm over the summer on a chance meeting, and they brought me in for an interview. And we were talking about some of the stuff that I was doing and things like that in law school. So naturally, being autistic comes up very quickly in conversation for me, so it's not something that I have to think about disclosing the way that a lot of others might. A lot of people who are neurodiverse might not because they're afraid of discrimination. I have the opposite problem. I can't not disclose. You Google my name, you're going to find out, and if I say nothing or if I deny it, I look like a liar, and then nobody's going to want to hire me. So even when I was in the interview process, it helped a lot disclosing I was neurodiverse, because not only did my current employer know because of that, my current employer also has a son on the autism spectrum. So he was especially sensitive and cared a lot about the issues that surround neurodiversity. I also find that telling people you're neurodiverse helps them understand, so it's not a shock later on if something goes wrong. I've seen that happen with people who don't disclose. They wait until there's an issue at work and then they tell HR, oh, by the way, I'm autistic, and then HR doesn't know what to do. That then they're afraid of ADA retaliation or some other thing, and then they start accommodating, when I think it's easier to be transparent and have an accommodation or discussion about things that are hard and easy for you at the same time, because every employer in interviews loves knowing strengths and weaknesses. Being neurodiverse is a great time to be able to say that, because you know your strengths and weaknesses. I feel like that's one of the best parts about being neurodiverse, is this hyper self-awareness where you know what's easy, what isn't easy, and what's natural for you. So in that process, I found it very easy to get to say, these are things that are hard for me. And now that I am practicing law, I have an easier time having that open communication. I think having an open channel of communication is the most important thing in the employment context for neurodiverse people, is having some way of being able to say, this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm not so good at, here's where I'm going to need help, is such a valuable thing.
Haley, I love how you broke down neurodiverse needs in the workplace to this idea about strengths and weaknesses that each individual is doing an inventory of in order to pursue our professional growth, whether we're employed or we're seeking employment or we're transitioning in our employment. At Digitability, we have a program called the Classroom Social Economy, which is designed to help people with neurodiverse needs navigate the workplace social and communication norms. We make some of those hidden social nuances very explicit. So for a population of people where those things may not be so intuitive, we help them define them, identify those behaviors, and then role play so that they really feel confident and empowered when heading into the workplace, and they know how to not only self-regulate but self-advocate for their needs. So while Digitability is helping people with neurodiverse needs prepare for their path in navigating workplace culture and workplace social communication norms, we also want to support employers in understanding how to embrace neurodiversity in their workplace and make it more accessible. Haley, in your Huffington Post article, you talked about the importance of opening dialogue in the workplace. You described it as monumental, especially in this latest chapter of your personal life story. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that conversation around neurodiversity in the workplace should be shaped.
If we're opening dialogue for everyone, especially people who are neurodiverse, who have the lowest employment rates of all, it's going to make things better for everyone. If we can have people who have trouble communicating, such as certain neurodiverse populations, and we're able to have open lines of communication with them, it shouldn't be a struggle to have open communication for everyone then. So I think what's important with neurodiverse, and the biggest myth in disability hiring generally, is that accommodations are going to be expensive, while the truth is, with accommodating neurodiverse people and other people with disabilities, most accommodations don't cost any money. And the median, if it does cost money, is $500 or less. So with that in mind, it's a very small investment to have a very talented and important part of the workforce included.
Yes, Haley, I love what you said about opening dialogue to create a better workplace process, because when you create an accessible environment for somebody who has any type of neurodiverse need, what you're actually doing is creating a better process for everybody. And it makes me think of the curb cut effect. For those of you who aren't familiar with the curb cut effect, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in the 70s, one of the outcomes of that law was that we now have cuts in the sidewalk, so ramps that allow people who may be in a wheelchair to access the street, to come off of the sidewalk and cross the street. But what that also did was make it easier for a parent pushing a stroller around in the neighborhood and needed to get around to run errands. It also made it easier for us to move our luggage if we're traveling, or moving furniture or large packages on a dolly. Sometimes the barriers to increasing neurodiversity in the workplace and creating these better systems is fear or misconception. Fear that it may be very expensive, fear around what a person with neurodiverse needs can contribute to the workplace. So I'd love to hear your ideas about how we might be able to break down some of those barriers or fears for employers who may not be as familiar with neurodiversity.
Absolutely, is having open communication is how all good relationships work, including employment relationships. So if we can have people who have trouble communicating, such as certain neurodiverse populations, and we're able to have open lines of communication with them, it shouldn't be a struggle to have open communication for everyone then. So I think what's important with neurodiverse, and the biggest myth in disability hiring generally, is that accommodations are going to be expensive, while the truth is, with accommodating neurodiverse people and other people with disabilities, most accommodations don't cost any money. And the median, if it does cost money, is $500 or less. So with that in mind, it's a very small investment to have a very talented and important part of the workforce included.
There's a phrase that I'm sure you've heard and that many people might be familiar with now, which is, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, meaning that, each individual is so unique and you can't broad brush any one person based on a diagnosis or label. To that extent, there has been a dramatic increase in autism awareness linked to the prevalence. And with that heightened awareness, also, unfortunately, comes stereotypes and subconscious biases that emerge from some of the communications about autism. As a self-advocate who identifies as a autistic woman, how do you feel about media representation of people with neurodiverse needs, specifically autism?
Oh my God, I can unpack this one for days. I actually just started writing about this. I don't know if it's going to get published or not, but I was writing my thoughts about it on Friday because there's a new show coming out on Freeform called Everything's Gonna Be Okay, and the lead actress is a woman on the spectrum who is playing an autistic character on television, and this is the first time I've ever seen that. It's the first time, one, I've seen a woman, or a teenage girl for that matter, represented on teenage TV. So seeing a woman represented on TV with autism is a huge deal, right? And it's an even bigger deal to have the actress as someone who is autistic playing an autistic character. So I don't know how the show's going to turn out in reality. I'm cautiously optimistic, but at the very least, at least the actress is one of us playing one of us. So that to me is a huge step forward, especially because girls generally seem to be very unrepresented or underrepresented in autism in the media. The only thing I could think of that was recent, I'm sure somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a Dakota Fanning movie about a year ago called Please Stand By, and she plays a Star Trek fanatic who wants to get her script sent to Warner Brothers. She lives in a group home. I don't know the whole story, but something about Star Trek and autism and Dakota Fanning. But the rest of representation that we see, at least that I could think of off the top of my head, is very male-centered, not written by autistic screenwriters or directors or any of that, nor are there autistic actors playing these people. But you think of Atypical, Rain Man, Big Bang Theory, all of these types of The Good Doctor. You think of these shows, and at least for me, I watch them and I think, this doesn't represent me. This doesn't represent people that I know.
So given that these representations do not align with how you identify and they don't feel real, how do you think these types of biases that are portrayed or these prejudices have created barriers for you? And how do you personally overcome or address these biases when you experience them in your life?
I mean, right now, a lot of the barriers that I have are, I think, the ones that any first-year lawyer has. So a lot of on-the-job learning and being mentored and things like that is realizing that law school doesn't 100% prepare you for what having a job is like. And as far as barriers go, I know there will always be other lawyers, clients, people generally that will question my competency and ability because I am a person with a disability, because I am autistic, and their version of autism does not include lawyers. But some of the barriers that I have faced so far, or at least that I know that I'm going to face as time goes on beyond that, are also gender bias. So the law profession tends to be kind of biased against women for a variety of reasons. And the first thing that I experienced, I actually went to a networking event not too long ago for attorneys, law students, judges, and all that stuff to get those professionalism credits that I need. And I was talking to a member of the bar at this event, another attorney, and despite the fact that I had a name tag that said Haley Moss Esquire on it, he assumed I was a first-year law student and started talking to me all about law school and how much I must be enjoying my first year of law school. So that happens a lot with women in this profession generally, is that we get mistaken for court reporters or interns or law students. I just didn't expect it to happen I just didn't expect it to happen so quickly. But at the same time, I just nicely said, well, my first year of practice is going really well, instead of trying to be upset or anything. And I remember telling my boss about this the next morning, and we all kind of laughed about it because, I mean, I understand that I have a baby face, so I didn't want to jump the gun and say maybe it's bias, but knowing that this happens to female attorneys all the time, I can't help but wonder. There's just a lot of ways to handle bias, I think, and I do believe in implicit bias. I mean, we all have it. If you've ever taken the Harvard implicit bias test, it will tell you that you definitely have these biases, even though we work very hard to overcome them. I just think there's a difference between having this bias implicitly that you know is part of your programming or social landscape and acting on it is something different. So feeling that someone might be an intern even though their name tag says they're not is one thing, but assuming and saying it to their face is another. That's acting on the bias. That's a form of prejudice rather than stereotyping. So when you go up that ladder of like stereotyping, prejudice, outward like bias and discrimination, when you start going up the ladder, it's a little different too.
Yes, I've certainly experienced some biases both as a woman and as a person who has some neurodiverse needs. These types of biases are deeply ingrained in our culture and our subconscious. And that's why sometimes legislation can be really influential in spearheading some of those changes that will elevate our society, especially around neurodiversity. And so as a lawyer, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you feel about the current legislative landscape when it comes to disability, including this current version of the American with Disabilities Act.
I want to start this off with, first, this is not the area of law I practice in. This is just something that I'm really excited about and love to talk about because I am an autistic person. And I think with neurodiversity is what often gets left out of our conversation is people forget that neurodiversity encompasses a lot of different ways of existing. That I will get criticism even like, well, not every autistic person fits this mold of neurodiverse employment, blah, blah, blah. And while that's true, neurodiversity is not just autism. Neurodiversity includes learning disabilities, ADHD, certain mental health conditions, people who survived a stroke even. That when you look at neurodiversity, it's very, very broad of having a different neurotype or brain profile. So I think that the Americans with Disabilities Act definitely needs to catch up with that. And I think we're just not used to neurodiversity, and socially, a lot of people don't see neurodiversity as that because it's something in identity. It's something that we're proud of. It's part of who we are, and it's a different way of existing, just like being a woman or being of a different religion, a different sexual orientation might be. So I think it's really hard to reconcile societal attitudes with neurodiversity versus how neurodiverse people view ourselves and figure out how do we best safeguard everybody.
Yes. Haley, in your Huffington Post article, you described your autism as being 100% embraced in your firm, and that also your firm is proactively looking at accessibility and how to increase neurodiversity. And you talk about how authentic this is and that you're not being employed merely as a form of tokenism or as a feel-good story. You recently shared a TED Talk with me by Stella Young, which is called I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much, where she describes a lot of what we see in the media about people with disabilities as inspiration porn. And we have a few clips from her TED Talk that we're going to play.
And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. And in the past few years, we've been able to propagate this lie even further via social media. You know, you may have seen images like this one. The only disability in life is a bad attitude. Or this one. Your excuse is invalid, indeed. Or this one. Before you quit, try. Yeah. These are just a couple of examples, but there are a lot of these images out there. You know, you might have seen the little girl with no hands drawing a picture with a pencil held in her mouth. You might have seen a child running on carbon fibre prosthetic legs. And these images, you know, there are lots of them out there. They are what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. But what if you are that person? And life as a disabled person is actually somewhat difficult. We do overcome some things. But the things that we're overcoming are not the things that you think they are. They are not things to do with our bodies. I use the term disabled people quite deliberately because I subscribe to what's called the social model of disability, which tells us that we are more disabled by our bodies, the society that we live in rather, than by our bodies and our diagnoses.
Stella Young does an amazing job of framing microaggressions towards people with disabilities, whether the aggression is intentional or not. We're going to make Stella Young's complete TED Talk available on our website. We're also going to archive this Lunch and Learn with Haley Moss and also make some information available on Digitability's Work Ready training. To access any of these resources, visit digitability.com/Haley Moss Fireside. Haley is an extremely vocal self-advocate who's pretty active on social media. I imagine that there are a ton of people that reach out to you who want to be supportive and send you some messages of support or express their support. Did you ever feel that some of their outreach or their comments may have been even subconsciously a microaggression, or that you've experienced microaggressions?
Absolutely. So even with this inspiration narrative, it is something that I feel very mixed on, especially because my story did go viral and did hit a lot of places. And a lot of the messages I get simply say, you're an inspiration. And I think when we're judging whether or not something exists just to inspire people or is an actual accomplishment or something like that, there's a couple things to consider. First, who's the one telling the story? If the person with a disability or neurodiversity isn't even featured in their own story, it probably is an othering or objectification to make neurotypical people feel good. So if I told a story about you without talking to you and talk to your dog, for instance, all about you, and all Franklin said is, Michelle is wonderful, and Michelle is such an inspiration, and Michelle didn't give up when everyone else, and I didn't think to talk to Michelle, or I talked to someone else, you would think, that doesn't seem right. But that happens a lot with people with disabilities when stories about us are told. I'm very lucky that people did talk to me, and it wasn't despite of this person's autism, she became a lawyer. It was, this person is autistic and is a lawyer, not despite or this person's a lawyer, but she's autistic. So I think it's how the story is phrased, how it's told, and who is in charge of the narrative. Because a lot of these stories aren't told about that person. And I also think it's important to see how we react to these stories about disability. When you see kids playing wheelchair basketball, you say, wow, thank God I'm not that kid. I can play basketball too. I see people, if I start seeing people like neurotypical people going, if someone with a disability can become a lawyer, I certainly can become a lawyer too. That's when it treads into that inspiration narrative that I feel uncomfortable with. I feel comfortable when people say that's inspiring because I am a neurodiverse person and didn't think it was really possible. And now that I see you, I realize that you're out there, you're visible, and we too can do awesome stuff. I do want to see, like Stella Young said, a day where it isn't a big deal when you go to school and your teacher's in a wheelchair. I look forward to that day. I do think that we do great things. And even with my story, I still find myself defending at times of, you know what? There's more to me than I became a lawyer, or I was nonverbal, now I'm a lawyer, because that is an inspiration narrative. But when you look at the totality of my life and where I've been, it's a little bit more of a, oh wow, this person really did a lot of stuff despite, or if you take disability out of the equation, you would still say, wow, this person did a lot of stuff. Of like writing books and raising money and art and all this stuff, you'd go, wow, that's interesting. But putting disability in the equation obviously makes it more of a story than not having disability. But you wouldn't, if it were no disability in the equation and it was like just person becomes a lawyer, you'd be like, okay, really? I think that's the best way to describe how I feel about it.
Yes, I hear you. There are so many nuances to telling the story of our personal and collective journeys. And those same nuances that exist in storytelling transfer over to how we talk about the characters in these stories. In this case, self-advocates with neurodiverse needs. It brings me to our next topic, which is language. Right now, there are two main schools of thought when we talk about disability and the language we use to describe disability. The first one is the use of people first language, which is to say something like this: Haley is a woman with autism, or Haley is a person with neurodiverse needs. People first language is what's considered to be the objective way of acknowledging, communicating, or reporting on disability. And the idea is that it's eliminating a stereotype by focusing on the fact that we're talking about a person rather than a disability or a characteristic. The second school of thought is identity first language, which is to say something to the extent of Haley Moss is an autistic woman. Haley Moss is autistic. So in many of the media headlines, you're referred to as an autistic woman, but I also hear you using both identity first and people first language.
Absolutely. I think what happens in the autism community is people get a little too hung up on language and then no other productive conversations happen because everybody's too busy being concerned about, is it person first or identity first? Personally, I use identity first when I talk about myself, but if you do use person first language with me or something else completely different, I'm not going to correct you. I'm not going to complain about it because I think there are far more important things than how I feel about language. I also think that if you're correcting how someone refers to themselves, that's a little bit more problematic. So if I say I'm autistic and you go, no, you're a person with autism, that's a problem. But if you still call me a person with autism, even though I don't call myself a person with autism, I'm not going to freak out. I'll freak out if you tell me I'm wrong for referring to myself differently than that. I think that's where I draw the line there. But when people get so hung up on language, I think it diminishes all the other issues that these communities face and need to address. If we're sitting here talking about identity first versus person first language and not addressing employment disparities or different biases or other things, or even healthcare or things like that actually matter for people with disabilities generally and autistic people, then we're definitely not going to move forward if all we're talking about is language. There's no one clear answer. Parents will feel one way, professionals will feel another way, self-advocates will feel another way, and really at the end of the day, the way I see it is we're all on the same team. We all want a better world. We all want more inclusion. We all want more opportunities, and we all want society to see the problems that we've been facing for years and to wake up and do something. That's how I feel about language. I just don't think it's the biggest deal in the world. I've seen stories about me refer to me as autistic. I've seen stories about me refer to me as a person with autism or a lawyer with autism. And I go, you know what? That's okay. And people go, do you care? And I'm like, not really. I mean, sometimes if I'm lucky, someone's going to ask me how I feel about it. If they do, I appreciate it. Like a lot of the stories do say I'm openly autistic because that's a word that my boss coined to describe me as openly autistic. And it's something that I've embraced. It's my also preference on identity first. So it's fine with me when that goes out, and I think it's a radical move in this community too. But also, I'm not going to complain if you say that I'm just a lawyer with autism. It's not how I describe myself, but I'm okay with it if that's what you feel with describing me in a piece that you wrote or something else like that, because really language is one of the least important things to me in this larger conversation.
Yes, either way. Identity first or people first, self-advocates are choosing the language that empowers them. And to your point, let's keep our eye on the prize and focus on the conversation that's going to change the landscape around employment and inclusion. As Digitability works to train more people with neurodiverse needs for today's tech-driven, highly social workplaces, we do a lot of research and understanding what the norms are and what the landscape looks like. And what we tend to find is that there are behaviors that people demonstrate that are perceived as successful behaviors that make you a successful and productive employee. And at the same time, there are behaviors that are perceived as problematic. So as a person with neurodiverse needs around memory and attention, this plays out in my own workplace. So if I'm in a meeting with my colleagues and we're really getting creative and generating ideas, I can get really excited about my idea and I will just interrupt and I will go ahead, get my idea out. And I do this because I'm very excited with all the creative energy, and I'm feeling the momentum, and I'm very much motivated by this collaborative process, but also I'm afraid I may forget. So it's an impulse to just kind of get it out, and it's a trigger effect. I've had to learn to self-regulate this. And the idea is, that I'm not internalizing any shame, but I'm understanding the impact that it can have, both in a positive and in a perceived problematic way. So I'm interested to know what are some of the behaviors that you might be self-regulating in the workplace, or what are the behaviors that you're not self-regulating in the workplace and are playing out in some interesting ways.
I feel very similar when you were talking about interrupting and ideas. It depends on the profession and also who you're working with. Like for me, when I do it at work, and sometimes I'm guilty of the same thing, it's perceived as a fearlessness, which is a positive thing, because a lot of people, especially with superiors, are afraid to say how they feel or whatever ideas they have because they're afraid of getting knocked down. For me, it's perceived as you're fearless and you're not afraid to tell us when we're wrong, and you're not afraid to tell us what you're thinking and what you want to accomplish. Me having one of those fearless moments is the reason that we had a social event at work last week, is because we were at lunch and my boss was talking about something and I said, since I've been here, we've never had like a happy hour or something. And one of my colleagues is looking at me with this complete embarrassment look, like, I can't believe you just said that. And my boss goes, you're right. We haven't. Make it happen. So we did. And I really think, in a way, it depends on perspective and perception too, is that it could be an asset. And I think we have to look at different neurodiverse strengths as a different way of thinking, not so much in these norms and boxes that neurotypical people like to place it in. That being said, when we talk about stimming and self-regulation, I do think as long as you're not hurting anybody, I'm fine with it. Sometimes my hands move a lot, even if I need to be still. And sometimes my hands move because I'm excited. And that's a joy that my body feels and I can't really contain. That's not hurting anyone. But if I were hitting people because I'm upset, that obviously is something that needs to be addressed and worked on, But I think as long as you're not hurting yourself or somebody else, I think certain behaviors are fine. But I also think it's important for employers to understand why this might happen. So us saying we're interrupting because we're excited, it might be perceived as rude, but with neurodiversity, it might also just mean this person will otherwise forget, can't write it down, or is so excited or so unafraid to tell you what they're feeling that you could see that as an asset at work too. It's all about perception, and that's why I think employers need to learn, and especially being here today and having a conversation about neurodiversity with neurodiverse people, I think that really makes a difference too, is, that makes a lot of sense when you say it that way, while a professional would go, well, self-regulation behaviors mean blah, 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 and this is how you should be regulating them and monitoring them and blah, 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 but that doesn't answer the question of, when my hands are moving, I'm just really excited, and when I get an awesome idea and we're having a face-to-face conversation and I just blurt it out, I just can't contain it and I have to tell you, and otherwise I might forget or you might not want to hear it.
I agree, and I really like what you had to say about pushing the envelope. Workplaces have traditionally been structured to not support neurodiversity, and in the spirit of the curb cut effect, we could push some of those existing boundaries in a meaningful way so that we are elevating the culture of an entire workplace and creating a healthier environment for employees that will make them more productive and more satisfied with their work. And at the same time, I can also recognize, and I'll use myself as an example, these boundaries in the workplace do exist because each individual may have their own definition of what those boundaries are. So by having a workplace culture, we can agree on what those boundaries should be and which ones may be productive. So while I may have a tendency to interrupt, and I can accept that, yes, that is part of who I am, I still need to be mindful and self-aware that this behavior may have an impact on my colleagues or friends or people that I'm collaborating with, and that they may find the need to express that this was a boundary of theirs. So that goes back to some of those concepts of social reciprocity, which is an extremely important part. And I think a big theme of this conversation has definitely been to continue the dialogue, to have these open conversations the way we're doing today. And I'm excited that this is going to be the first of many conversations that we can explore together, and I look forward to our next call.